The polished granite floor of the Hanover Pacific Bank in downtown Bakersfield reflected the crisp morning sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows. At 10:04 a.m., the lobby hummed with a low, steady thrum of activity. The air, conditioned to a precise 72 degrees, carried the faint scent of disinfectant and the hushed murmurs of conversations. Tellers worked with practiced efficiency, their fingers dancing across keyboards, while clients waited patiently in plush, burgundy armchairs. Darius Langston, dressed in a meticulously tailored dark gray suit, stepped through the revolving doors, his presence a subtle disruption to the carefully orchestrated calm. He felt the familiar weight of eyes on him, a sensation he'd grown accustomed to, a constant hum beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Just another day, he thought, adjusting the strap of his briefcase. Another room to navigate. He approached the reception desk, where a young woman with a meticulously pinned-up hairstyle offered a perfunctory smile. Before Darius could speak, a man in a slightly too tight navy suit emerged from a side office. Richard Gaines, the branch manager, surveyed the lobby with an air of proprietorship. His gaze snagged on Darius, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. Darius's stomach tightened. He recognized that look, the subtle tightening of the lips, the almost imperceptible narrowing of the eyes, a language spoken in the silent spaces between words. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was going to be one of those encounters. Gaines approached him, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Excuse me, sir. This area is for clients only." The words, polite on the surface, carried an undercurrent of dismissal. Darius felt a surge of anger, a hot, prickly sensation that crawled up his spine. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. This wasn't new. It was a well-worn script, played out in different settings, with different actors, but always the same underlying theme. "I'm a client," Darius responded, his voice even and controlled. "I have a meeting with Mr. Callahan at 10. He could feel the weight of Gaines's scrutiny, a palpable pressure in the air. "Are you sure you're at the right bank?" Gaines asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled skepticism. Darius's jaw clenched. He imagined, for a fleeting moment, letting loose the torrent of frustration building inside him. He pictured himself dismantling Gaines's carefully constructed facade of politeness, exposing the prejudice lurking beneath. But he pushed the impulse down. It wouldn't serve him. It never did. This wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about a slow, steady dismantling of a system. "I'm quite certain," Darius replied, his voice still calm, but with a steely edge that hinted at the iron will beneath. He pulled out his phone, displaying the email confirmation of his meeting with Gerald Callahan, the regional vice president. A young woman, Elena Rivera, one of the tellers, watched the exchange with a growing sense of unease. She'd seen Gaines's behavior before, the subtle but unmistakable way he treated clients of color. She felt a knot of discomfort in her stomach, a quiet voice whispering that something wasn't right. But she'd remained silent, paralyzed by the fear of repercussions. This time, though, something was different. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity in Mr. Langston's demeanor, the way he held himself despite the blatant disrespect. Or perhaps it was simply the cumulative weight of witnessing these microaggressions time and time again. Whatever the reason, she felt a surge of righteous anger, a sudden and unexpected burst of courage. "Mr. Gaines," Elena spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor of nerves running through her. "Mr. Langston is here to meet with Mr. Callahan. I confirmed his appointment myself." Gaines's face flushed a deep crimson. He turned on Elena, his eyes blazing. "Miss Rivera, please don't interfere," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. Darius watched the exchange, a strange calm settling over him. He knew this was a pivotal moment, a small crack in the edifice of ingrained prejudice. He saw the fear in Elena's eyes, but also the unwavering resolve. He knew she was risking something by speaking up, and he felt a surge of respect for her. Just then, Gerald Callahan emerged from his office, his brow furrowed in concern. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the tense scene. Before Gaines could respond, Darius stepped forward, handing Callahan his phone. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Mr. Gaines seems to think I'm not a client." Callahan glanced at the email confirmation on Darius's phone, then back at Gaines, his expression hardening. "Richard," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "my office." "Now." Gaines, his face ashen, followed Callahan into his office, the closing door punctuating the silence that descended upon the lobby. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Elena, her hands trembling slightly, returned to her station, her heart pounding in her chest. Darius stood quietly, his gaze fixed on the closed office door. He knew what was happening on the other side. The hushed reprimands, the veiled threats, the desperate attempts at damage control. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Julia Kim, his head of communications. "Darius, what's the situation at Hanover Pacific? I'm getting reports of an incident." He typed a brief reply. "Minor issue. Being resolved." He knew Julia wouldn't be satisfied with that, but he needed a moment to process, to decide how to play this. He could feel the familiar pressure to let it go, to avoid making waves. But this time, something felt different. He was tired of the constant compromises, the subtle indignities. The office door opened, and Callahan emerged, followed by a pale and shaken Gaines. Callahan approached Darius, extending his hand. "Mr. Langston," he said, his voice laced with genuine remorse, "I sincerely apologize for this unfortunate incident. Mr. Gaines's actions in no way reflect the values of Hanover Pacific." He paused, then added, "Mr. Gaines is no longer employed by this bank." Darius nodded, accepting Callahan's apology. He knew this wasn't the end, not by a long shot, but it was a start, a small victory in a long and arduous battle. He glanced over at Elena, offering her a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. She met his gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He knew she wouldn't say anything. Neither would he. Some battles were fought in silence. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Amamira Stanton, SVP of Corporate Affairs at Hanover Pacific. "Mr. Langston, I understand there was an incident at our Bakersfield branch. I want to personally assure you that we are taking this matter very seriously." The fluorescent lights of the bank lobby hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the rising tension. Darius Langston stood his ground, a small, almost imperceptible tightening in his jaw, the only outward sign of his growing frustration. He'd envisioned this meeting going differently. He'd pictured a handshake, a polite exchange, a discussion of expanding Langston Dynamics' already substantial portfolio with Hanover Pacific. Not this. Not being treated like a suspect. The absurdity of it gnawed at him. Here he was, Darius Langston, founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the state, a man whose company's deposits contributed significantly to this very bank's bottom line, being questioned about his right to be here. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside if you don't have an appointment," Gaines repeated, his voice laced with a condescending patience that grated on Darius's nerves. The man's eyes, pale blue and devoid of warmth, flicked over Darius's attire, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on his bespoke suit. A suit, Darius thought bitterly, that probably cost more than Gaines's entire monthly salary. "I just told you I do have one," Darius responded, his voice calm, controlled. Inside, however, a storm was brewing. He felt the familiar surge of anger, the hot, prickly sensation that crawled up his neck. He fought it down, reminding himself of his objective. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to make a point. Gaines puffed out his chest, a subtle power play. "With whom, sir? I haven't seen your name on the schedule." The words were polite enough, but the tone dripped with disbelief, the unspoken implication hanging heavy in the air. "Someone like you wouldn't have a meeting with someone like me." Darius felt a flicker of something cold and hard settle in his stomach. He'd faced this kind of thinly veiled prejudice before. It was a familiar enemy, an insidious microaggression that chipped away at his composure, bit by bit. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. He wouldn't give Gaines the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. With Mr. Thompson, Andrew Thompson, Darius enunciated clearly, each syllable precise. He reached into his briefcase, the smooth leather cool against his fingertips, and retrieved his phone. He could feel Gaines's gaze fixed on him, heavy with suspicion. He pulled up the email confirming his appointment. The subject line stark and unambiguous. Meeting with Darius Langston Dynamics. He held the phone out to Gaines, the screen illuminated with the undeniable proof. Gaines hesitated, his eyes darting from the phone to Darius's face and back again. He seemed unwilling to acknowledge the evidence before him, clinging to his initial judgment. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken assumptions and simmering resentment. Darius felt a strange detachment, as if he were observing the scene from a distance. This was it, he realized. This was the moment he'd read about, heard about, experienced countless times in different forms throughout his life. The moment where his success, his accomplishments, his very presence were rendered invisible by the color of his skin. Just as Gaines opened his mouth, presumably to utter another dismissive remark, a voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "Mr. Langston, my apologies for the wait." The voice was soft, hesitant, yet clear. Darius turned to see a young woman, her name tag identifying her as Elena Rivera, approaching from behind a row of teller windows. She had warm brown eyes and a nervous smile playing on her lips. She looked at him, not with the suspicion Gaines had displayed, but with a flicker of recognition. Relief washed over Darius, a sudden thawing of the icy knot in his stomach. Someone had seen him. Someone had acknowledged him. Gaines turned, his face a mask of confusion. "Elena, what are you?" He began, but Elena cut him off. "Mr. Langston has a 10 a.m. appointment with Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice gaining confidence. She glanced at Gaines, her expression a mixture of apology and quiet defiance. "He's been waiting for quite some time." The color drained from Gaines's face. His eyes darted from Elena to Darius, his carefully constructed facade of authority crumbling. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find words. The realization of his mistake, the public exposure of his prejudice, seemed to have rendered him speechless. "Mr. Langston, my apologies," he stammered finally, the words sounding hollow and insincere. The arrogance that had been so evident just moments before had vanished, replaced by a nervous, almost frantic energy. He gestured vaguely towards the elevators. "Mr. Thompson's office is on the 5th floor. Please go right ahead." Darius nodded curtly, a small, tight smile playing on his lips. He didn't bother responding verbally. He turned and walked towards the elevators, the quiet click of his heels on the marble floor echoing in the suddenly hushed lobby. He could feel Gaines's gaze burning into his back, but he didn't turn around. He pressed the button for the 5th floor, the cool metal a welcome sensation against his skin. As the elevator doors closed, effectively shutting out the scene behind him, he allowed himself a small sigh. He had won this small battle, but the war was far from over. He knew this incident was just a microcosm of a larger systemic issue, a subtle yet pervasive prejudice that he and countless others faced every day. Even as he stepped out of the elevator and into the plush, carpeted hallway of the 5th floor, he could still feel the residue of the encounter clinging to him. He pulled out his phone and texted Julia Kim, his head of communications. "Incident at Hanover Pacific. Need to strategize PR response. Call me after my meeting." He knew Julia would already be anticipating the fallout, preparing a carefully crafted statement that would both acknowledge the incident and reaffirm Langston Dynamics' commitment to diversity and inclusion. He entered Andrew Thompson's office, his demeanor shifting seamlessly back to the composed, confident businessman he was known to be. He shook Thompson's hand, his grip firm, and launched into the details of his proposal, the unpleasantness in the lobby fading, for now, into the background of his mind. But it wouldn't be forgotten. It would be filed away, another data point in the ongoing struggle for equality, a quiet reminder of the subtle resistance he would continue to wage against the insidious forces of prejudice. The polished marble floor reflected the opulent chandeliers, casting a cold, sterile light across the bank lobby. Darius Langston stood there, a figure of quiet strength amidst the muted whispers and rustling papers. He adjusted his tailored suit, the subtle shift a practiced gesture that belied the churning unease within him. He'd anticipated this. Not the specifics, not the blatant dismissal, but the underlying current of prejudice, the unspoken assumption that a black man in a bank lobby couldn't possibly be a client of significance. He'd braced himself, built his defenses, yet the casual disdain in Richard Gaines's eyes still pricked like a needle. Gaines, the branch manager, a man whose carefully constructed image of authority seemed to crumble with each passing second, attempted to regain control. His face, flushed a mottled pink, tightened into a strained smile. "There seems to be some misunderstanding," he stammered, his gaze darting between Darius and the young Latina employee, Elena Rivera, who stood beside him, small but unwavering. Internally, Gaines cursed his luck. He'd thought her a timid, unassuming girl, the type to blend into the background. He hadn't anticipated her quiet strength, the steel in her spine that held her ground. Darius watched him, his expression unreadable. He knew the type men like Gaines built their careers on maintaining a facade, on upholding a perceived order, even if it meant perpetuating injustice. He could practically hear the frantic calculations whirring behind Gaines's eyes, the desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Yes," Darius agreed, his voice smooth as polished obsidian. "A misunderstanding." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. The other bank staff, previously absorbed in their tasks, now looked up, their curiosity piqued. The atmosphere in the lobby had shifted, charged with an unspoken tension. Elena Rivera, he noted, held his gaze. A flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher, perhaps admiration, perhaps gratitude, passed through her eyes. He allowed himself a small, internal nod of acknowledgement. "I have a 2 o'clock appointment with Mr. Caldwell," Darius continued, his gaze fixed on Gaines. He deliberately reached into his breast pocket, withdrawing a platinum business card, the embossed lettering catching the light. He held out, not towards Gaines, but towards Elena. "Perhaps you could inform Mr. Caldwell that Darius Langston is here." Elena took the card, her fingers brushing against his. The contact, brief as it was, sent a strange jolt through him. He dismissed it, attributing it to the heightened tension of the moment. He saw her eyes widen slightly as she read the name, then looked back at Gaines, her expression a mixture of disbelief and quiet indignation. Gaines, visibly flustered, stammered, Mr. Langston, I apologize." "I didn't realize," his voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Darius knew exactly what Gaines hadn't realized. He hadn't realized that the man standing before him, the man he'd dismissed as an unwelcome visitor, was a man of considerable influence. "My company," Darius stated, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight, "Langston Dynamics, holds over $12 million across 5 accounts with this bank." The words landed like a bombshell. The hushed whispers in the lobby ceased entirely. Every eye was on them. Darius could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the palpable ripple of shock that emanated from the onlookers. He saw the blood drain from Gaines's face, leaving him ashen. The carefully constructed mask of authority crumbled completely. Gaines stammered, his eyes darting nervously around the lobby. "I didn't realize you weren't listed in our local client files, I assumed." He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and awkward in the sudden silence. Sometimes we get walk-ins from the shelter 2 blocks over." The words, laced with barely veiled prejudice, hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Darius felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but he tamped it down. This wasn't about him, not entirely. It was about the countless others who faced this kind of casual racism every day, the ones who didn't have the platform or the resources to challenge it. He looked at Gaines, his gaze steady and unwavering. "And what," he asked, his voice deceptively soft, "does that have to do with me?" The question, simple yet loaded, hung in the air, unanswered. Gaines opened his mouth, then closed it again, his face a mask of bewildered shame. He looked like a man caught in a lie. stripped bare for all to see. Darius felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was fleeting, replaced by a weary resignation. This wasn't a victory, not really. It was a small battle won in a much larger war. Elena returned, her face pale but determined. "Mr. Caldwell is waiting for you, Mr. Langston." He's very apologetic. Behind her, a tall, imposing man strode towards them, his expression a mixture of concern and barely controlled anger. This was Gerald Callahan, the regional vice president, a man Darius had met once before at a corporate function. Callahan reached them, extending a hand. "Mr. Langston, I am so incredibly sorry for this egregious misunderstanding. I assure you, this is not representative of Hanover Pacific's values." He turned to Gaines, his voice dropping to an icy tone. "Richard, please join me in my office." The dismissal was swift and unceremonious. Gaines, looking utterly defeated, mumbled something unintelligible and followed Callahan towards the back offices. Darius watched them go, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't over. There would be apologies, assurances of change, perhaps even a diversity training initiative. But the underlying problem, the systemic bias that permeated society, that wouldn't be so easily eradicated. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Julia Kim, his head of communications. "Darius," she said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "I just got a call from Amamira Stanton at Hanover Pacific. She's aware of the situation at the branch. What's our strategy?" Darius closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He could escalate this, make it public, demand accountability. He could ignite a firestorm that would scorch the bank's reputation. But what would that achieve? Another news cycle, another hashtag, another fleeting moment of outrage. He opened his eyes, a new resolve hardening his gaze. "No," he said, his voice firm. "Not yet. Let's see what they offer. Let's see if they're willing to make real, tangible changes. And if they're not," he paused, a subtle edge creeping into his voice, "then we'll talk strategy." The heavy glass doors swung open, admitting a gust of wind and a man whose brisk entrance cut through the tense stillness of the bank lobby. Gerald Callahan, the regional vice president, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, swept in, his gaze immediately assessing the scene. Darius Langston stood, a figure of quiet power, his posture unchanged, a subtle shift in the set of his jaw, the only outward sign of the inner turmoil he'd weathered in the last few minutes. Callahan's eyes, sharp and shrewd, flickered across the small tableau. The flushed face of Richard Gaines, the wide-eyed Elena Rivera, the scattered brochures on the polished marble floor remnants of a confrontation he instinctively grasped. He felt a familiar, not tighten in his stomach, a premonition of the headache to come. Damage control, he thought, the words echoing the cold efficiency that had propelled him up the corporate ladder. Always damage control. "Apologies, I ran into traffic on 99, Callahan said, his voice smooth, projecting an air of calm control that belied the churning calculations beneath. He offered a brief, apologetic nod to Darius, his eyes carefully avoiding Gaines's. This subtle gesture, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tension, was not lost on Darius. He felt a flicker of something akin to relief, a fragile tendril of hope in the sterile, hostile environment. He'd braced himself for another round of justification, for the exhausting task of proving his worth, his right to simply be in this space. But Callahan's demeanor, the almost imperceptible shift in his gaze, hinted at a different outcome. "What happened?" Callahan asked, his eyes finally settling on Gaines, his tone deceptively neutral. Gaines stammered, his carefully constructed composure crumbling under the weight of Callahan's scrutiny. "There was some confusion. I didn't realize Mr. Langston had an appointment." He avoided Darius's gaze, his eyes darting nervously towards the silent Elena, as if seeking an ally, a corroboration of his fabricated narrative. He felt a prickle of fear, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He'd dealt with difficult clients before, weather complaints, but this felt different. This felt like the ground shifting beneath his feet, the precariousness of his position suddenly, starkly revealed. Callahan's gaze hardened, the polite veneer cracking to reveal the steely pragmatism beneath. He knew. He knew without needing the details spelled out. The subtle cues, the body language, the palpable tension in the air, it all painted a clear picture. Years of navigating the corporate landscape had honed his ability to read between the lines, to dissect the nuances of human interaction. Racism, plain and simple. The thought resonated in his mind, cold and hard. He felt a surge of anger, not at Gaines's prejudice that was unfortunately a predictable variable in his world, but at the mess, the inconvenience, the potential fallout. Did you ask his name? Callahan's voice was low, controlled, each word a precise incision. Gaines swallowed hard, the knot in his throat constricting. I assumed did. You. Check. The schedule. Before asking him to leave, Callahan's voice was still quiet, but the steel was unmistakable now. He saw the blood drain from Gaines's face, the man's carefully constructed facade dissolving into a mask of fear. He felt a flicker of grim satisfaction, a cold, detached pleasure in witnessing the dismantling of Gaines's carefully cultivated authority. Darius watched the exchange unfold, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Anger, yes, a simmering resentment that threatened to boil over, but also a strange sense of detachment, a weary acceptance of the familiar script. He'd played this role before, the successful black man forced to prove his legitimacy, to navigate the minefield of microaggressions and outright prejudice. He'd learned to anticipate the subtle slights, the dismissive glances, the underlying assumption of inadequacy. He'd learned to wear a mask of composure, to channel his anger into quiet resistance. He thought of Julia, his head of communications, already drafting the press release, anticipating the inevitable social media storm. He thought of the burden of representation, the weight of being a symbol, a spokesperson for an entire community. He longed for the simplicity of anonymity, the freedom to simply be. Callahan turned to Darius, his expression carefully neutral. Mr. Langston, my sincere apologies for this misunderstanding. Please come with me. We can discuss your business in my office. Darius nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible movement. He followed Callahan, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent lobby. He could feel the weight of the gazes on his back, the silent scrutiny of the other patrons, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. He felt a surge of exhaustion, a deep weariness that settled in his bones. He'd won this battle, perhaps, but the war was far from over. As Callahan escorted Darius towards his office, he pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He had a call to make, damage control to initiate. He needed to speak to Amamira Stanton, the SVP of Corporate Affairs. This incident needed to be contained, neutralized. Gaines would be gone, of course. A sacrificial lamb offered at the altar of public perception. He felt no remorse, only a cold, pragmatic assessment of the situation. Necessary casualties, he thought, the words echoing the ruthless calculus of corporate survival. In the quiet of Callahan's office, Darius finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of his grandfather, a man who had faced far greater injustices, endured far harsher realities. He thought of the quiet dignity, the unwavering resilience that had defined his grandfather's life. He thought of the subtle acts of resistance, the small victories won in the face of overwhelming odds. He knew that his response to this incident, his choice of action, would carry weight, would resonate beyond the confines of this sterile bank lobby. He would not shout. He would not rage. He would choose the path of quiet resistance, the subtle subversion of expectations. He would succeed. He would thrive. He would be a living testament to the enduring power of resilience. The opulent lobby of Hanover Pacific Bank hummed with the low thrum of hushed conversations and the click of heels on polished marble. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Darius Langston stood amidst the quiet activity, a still point in the orchestrated flow, the weight of Richard Gaines's dismissive words settling like a stone in his gut. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, a familiar prickle of indignation. But his expression remained carefully neutral. He had learned long ago that anger, openly displayed, only served to confirm the prejudices of men like Gaines. Elena Rivera's hesitant voice cut through the tension. Her words, though quiet, carried a surprising weight in the cavernous space. "Mr. Gaines, I saw Mr. Langston's name on the schedule. His meeting with Miss Stanton is at 10. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Challenging a superior, especially one like Gaines, felt like tempting fate. But the blatant injustice of the situation, the casual dismissal of a man clearly deserving of respect, had spurred her to action. She risked a glance at Darius, his impassive face giving nothing away. Gaines's face tightened, a flush creeping up his neck. He opened his mouth to retort, but the arrival of a tall, impeccably dressed man cut him short. Gerald Callahan, the regional VP, surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. He had sensed a disturbance from his office overlooking the lobby. "What's the hold up here?" he inquired, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "Just a slight misunderstanding, Gerald," Gaines stammered, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. He shot a venomous look at Elena, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. Her stomach clenched, a knot of fear tightening, yet she held her ground. Callahan's gaze shifted to Darius, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Mr. Langston, I apologize for the delay. Almamira is expecting you." He turned back to Gaines, his expression hardening. "Richard, a word in my office." The unspoken dismissal hung in the air, heavy and final. The walk to the private office felt like an eternity. Gaines trailed behind Callahan, his steps leaden, the confident swagger replaced by a desperate, almost pleading gait. Darius watched them go, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He felt a flicker of satisfaction, a small victory won, yet a deeper unease remained. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger disease. Inside the sterile, modern office, Callahan wasted no time. "You're done here, Richard. Clean out your desk." His voice was devoid of emotion, a clinical pronouncement of professional execution. Gaines's face paled, his jaw slack. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that his career at Hanover Pacific was over. Callahan turned to Darius, his expression contorted with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Mr. Langston, I am profoundly sorry for this incident. I assure you, this is not representative of Hanover Pacific's values." He launched into a flurry of apologies, promises of internal investigations, HR reviews, and legal repercussions. Darius listened patiently, his gaze steady, his thoughts swirling. He recognized the sincerity in Callahan's apology, the genuine desire to rectify the situation. But he also knew that this wasn't just about one prejudiced branch manager. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "that's not a bad apple problem. That's culture." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Callahan's carefully constructed composure faltered. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the depth of the problem. It wasn't just about firing Gaines. It was about dismantling the insidious system that allowed men like him to thrive. He looked at Darius, a flicker of understanding dawning in his eyes. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken acknowledgments. Back in the lobby, Elena returned to her workstation, her hands trembling slightly. She felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. She had done the right thing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there would be repercussions. Across town, in the sleek, minimalist offices of Langston Dynamics, Julia Kim, head of communications, was already strategizing. She had received a terse message from Darius outlining the incident. Her mind raced, calculating the potential fallout, crafting the perfect response. This could be a PR nightmare, or an opportunity to spark a much-needed conversation. Almamira Stanton, having been briefed on the situation, felt a wave of anger wash over her. She had worked tirelessly to build a culture of inclusivity at Hanover Pacific, and this incident felt like a personal betrayal. She knew this would require more than just a dismissal. It demanded a systemic overhaul, a deep dive into the bank's culture, a commitment to real change. Darius, finally seated in Amamira's office, felt a weary resignation settle over him. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. He knew the fight for equality was a long and arduous one, a constant push against the tide of ingrained prejudice. He wouldn't let this incident break him. He would use it. He would channel his anger, his frustration, into quiet, persistent resistance. He would continue to build his empire, to create opportunities, to be a living testament to the resilience and brilliance of his community. He would not be silenced. He would not be erased. He would continue to rise. The low hum of the engine vibrated through the leather seats, a subtle tremor mirroring the unease that coiled in Darius's gut. He tapped a finger against the steering wheel, the rhythm irregular, a staccato beat to the silent anger still pulsing beneath his skin. He hadn't driven far from Hanover Pacific, the imposing building now shrinking in his rearview mirror, but the weight of the encounter pressed on him, a familiar burden. He glanced at his phone, the screen illuminating a new message from Julia Kim. Incident at Hanover Pacific, it read. They're trying to do damage control before this leaks. A tight knot formed in his jaw. Damage control. As if his experience, the casual dismissal of his presence, could be swept under the rug, sanitized and forgotten. He closed his eyes, the ghost of Richard Gaines's condescending smirk flickering behind his eyelids. He thought about Elena, her quiet defiance a small flame in the sterile chill of the bank. He pictured the others in the lobby, their averted gazes, their silent complicity. He saw himself, standing there, forced to prove his worth, to justify his existence in a space where he should have been welcomed. The exhaustion settled deep in his bones, a familiar ache. He wasn't sure he had the energy for another battle. He slipped the phone into his pocket, the unread message a silent promise of the storm to come. He needed time, a moment of quiet to process the dissonance, the jarring contrast between the respect he commanded in the tech world and the casual racism he still encountered in everyday life. He drove on, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, a backdrop to the turbulent thoughts swirling in his mind. The soft click of the door echoed in the stillness of his home, a welcome sanctuary from the noise of the city, the noise of the world. He shed his jacket, the weight of it mirroring the weight he felt lifting from his shoulders as he stepped into the familiar comfort of his own space. The gentle hum of the refrigerator, the soft glow of a lamp in the corner, these small details grounded him, reminding him of the solid foundation he had built for himself, a world away from the casual prejudice of Richard Gaines. He poured himself a glass of water, the cool liquid a soothing balm against the lingering heat of anger. He thought again about Julia's message, the urgency in her words a stark reminder that this incident, this small but significant battle, was far from over. He knew what was expected of him, the carefully crafted response, the public display of righteous indignation, the demand for accountability. He had played that role before, donned the armor of the successful black entrepreneur fighting against systemic racism. But tonight, something felt different. The weariness was deeper, the disillusionment more profound. He walked over to the window, the city lights twinkling like scattered diamonds against the velvet backdrop of the night. He thought about Elena, the quiet courage in her eyes, the small act of defiance that had shifted the balance of power in that sterile bank lobby. He wondered about the repercussions she might face, the price she might pay for speaking truth to power. He thought about the others in the lobby, the silent witnesses, the ones who chose to look away, to remain complicit in the face of injustice. He wondered about their lives, their own struggles, their own silent battles. He realized, with a clarity that startled him, that this wasn't just about him. It was about Elena, about the countless others who faced these microaggressions, these daily indignities, the constant erosion of their worth. This wasn't just about proving who he was, it was about exposing who they were, the Richard Gaines of the world, the ones who clung to their prejudice, their power, their carefully constructed illusions of superiority. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that the lesson wasn't about fighting fire with fire. It wasn't about proving his worth to those who refused to see it. The lesson was about holding a mirror up to their own ugliness, letting them see the reflection of their own prejudice, their own smallness. He picked up his phone, the screen still displaying Julia's unread message. He knew she was waiting, his team was waiting, the world was waiting for his response. He took a deep breath, the quiet of his home a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside. He opened his social media app, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He thought about the carefully crafted statements, the strategic pronouncements, the carefully calibrated responses that were expected of him. He closed his eyes, the image of Elena's steady gaze, the quiet strength in her voice, echoing in his mind. He opened his eyes, his fingers moving across the keyboard, composing a simple, unadorned message. Sometimes, he typed, the lesson isn't about proving who you are. Sometimes the lesson is about showing people who they've always been. He pressed send, the quiet click of the button echoing in the stillness of his home, a small ripple in the vast ocean of the internet, a silent promise of the change to come. He put the phone down, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He knew the fight was far from over, but tonight he had chosen a different weapon, a different battlefield. Tonight, he had chosen silence as his loudest roar. The crisp white envelope bearing the Hanover Pacific Bank logo felt strangely heavy in Darius's hand. The weight, he knew, wasn't physical. It was the weight of expectation, of the countless microaggressions and outright dismissals that had led to this moment. He traced the embossed lettering with his thumb, the smooth surface a stark contrast to the simmering anger he still felt. The memory of Gaines's dismissive sneer, the casual assumption of his insignificance, lingered like a phantom limb. He'd replayed the scene countless times in his head, each iteration a fresh sting. Had he overreacted? Should he have made more of a scene? No. His silence had been a more potent weapon. It had forced them to confront their own prejudice, stripped bare of any convenient excuses. He opened the envelope, the stiff paper crackling in the quiet of his office. Inside, a carefully worded letter apologized for the misunderstanding at their branch. Darius's lips curled into a wry smile. Misunderstanding. Such a benign word for such a blatant act of discrimination. He scanned the rest of the letter, his eyes catching on the key phrases. Commitment to diversity and inclusion training. Review of internal policies. Zero tolerance for discrimination. Standard corporate jargon, designed to appease and deflect. He felt a familiar wave of cynicism wash over him. How many times had he heard these empty promises? His phone buzzed. It was Julia Kim, his head of communications. Darius, have you seen the bank statement? Her voice was tight with a mixture of anger and anticipation. He could practically see her pacing her office, phone pressed to her ear. It's surprisingly comprehensive. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. Surprisingly? Yes. They're acknowledging systemic issues, not just blaming it on one rogue employee. They're even mentioning implicit bias training. There was a pause, then a hesitant. Did you say something to them? Threaten legal action. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. No threats, Julia. Just a conversation. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, the gesture a subconscious attempt to soothe the lingering tension. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Words are cheap. We need to see action. Exactly, Julia agreed, her voice regaining its usual crisp efficiency. I've already drafted a response. We'll acknowledge their apology, but emphasize that we'll be monitoring their progress closely. We need to make sure this isn't just a PR stunt. Across town, in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of Hanover Pacific Bank, Amamira Stanton, SVP of Corporate Affairs, addressed a group of tense executives. The statement is finalized. It goes live in 5 minutes. Her voice was calm, but her gaze swept over the faces around the table, assessing their reactions. She'd spent the last 24 hours in crisis mode, navigating the fallout from Gaines's disastrous encounter with Langston. The internal investigation had been swift and damning. Gaines's history of subtly discriminatory behavior, previously ignored or dismissed, now stood in stark relief. Gerald Callahan, the regional vice president, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd initially tried to downplay the incident, attributing it to a miscommunication. But Amamira had shut that down quickly. This wasn't about one employee's mistake. It was about the bank's image, its values, and its bottom line. The quiet of his home was a stark contrast to the simmering tension he'd carried within him throughout the day. Darius stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his modern apartment, the cityscape a glittering tapestry below. He watched the rhythmic pulse of traffic lights, the tiny cars resembling beetles scurrying along their designated paths. But his mind wasn't on the view. It was replaying the scene in the bank lobby, each moment etched into his memory with unsettling clarity. Gaines's dismissive tone, the condescending glance, the casual assumption that he didn't belong. The sting of it, though familiar, hadn't lessened. He'd felt it before, a prickle of anger, a wave of frustration, the urge to lash out. But experience had taught him a different kind of power, the power of quiet resistance. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, the gesture almost unconscious. He could have yelled, could have demanded respect, could have made a scene. But what would that have achieved? Another headline? Another viral video? Another example of an angry black man? No. He knew there was a deeper, more potent way to dismantle the ingrained prejudices he faced daily. A way that chipped away at the foundation of systemic racism, rather than simply scratching the surface. He remembered Elena Rivera's quiet intervention, her voice calm but firm. She hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to make a grand gesture. She simply stated the facts, corrected the record, and in doing so, exposed Gaines's bias for what it was. It was her subtle act of defiance that had truly shifted the balance of power. He thought of Julia Kim's measured response, already strategizing on how to use the incident to further their diversity initiatives. Julia understood the game. She knew how to leverage these moments, turning them into opportunities for meaningful change. Her pragmatism was a necessary counterpoint to his own visceral reactions. He appreciated her sharp mind, her ability to see the bigger picture even amidst the emotional turmoil. Even Callahan's swift action, the immediate dismissal of Gaines, spoke volumes. While it was undoubtedly a damage control maneuver, it was still a victory of sorts. A small crack in the edifice of institutional racism. A signal, however faint, that the old ways were no longer acceptable. He turned from the window, the city lights blurring slightly as his focus shifted inwards. He thought about the countless microaggressions he'd faced throughout his life, the subtle slights, the dismissive looks, the unspoken assumptions, the constant need to prove himself, to be twice as good to get half the recognition, the exhaustion that came with constantly navigating a world not designed for him. He knew this incident was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle he was determined to solve, one piece at a time. A soft chime from his phone broke through his thoughts. It was Amamira Stanton, offering a personal apology on behalf of the bank. He listened patiently, her words carefully chosen, her tone sincere. He could almost hear the gears turning behind her polished pronouncements, the calculations of corporate damage control. But beneath that, he sensed something else, a genuine desire to make amends, a recognition of the deeper issues at play. He ended the call, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Perhaps, just perhaps, things were beginning to change. He walked over to his desk, the sleek surface reflecting the ambient light. He picked up a small, framed photograph, his fingers tracing the edges. It was a picture of his grandfather, a proud man who had lived through a different era, an era of overt segregation and blatant discrimination. He thought about the stories his grandfather had told him, stories of resilience, of quiet dignity in the face of adversity, stories that had shaped him, that had instilled in him a deep understanding of the power of perseverance. He set the photograph back down, a quiet resolve settling within him. He knew his journey wasn't over, that the fight for equality was a marathon, not a sprint. But he also knew he wasn't alone. There were others, like Elena, like Julia, like Amamira, who were fighting alongside him, each in their own way. And that, he realized, was what gave him hope. He looked directly ahead, his gaze unwavering, as if speaking to an unseen audience. "You don't have to shout to be heard," he murmured, his voice low and resonant. "Sometimes standing still and speaking plainly is what shakes the ground." He paused, the silence pregnant with meaning. "Don't be okay with it. Speak up.